Hey everyone, this is James Lindsay, and you are listening to the new Discourses Bullets podcast, where I give a short bullet point-like summary of a single topic from woke Marxism that we all need to understand so we can beat it. And I get asked a certain question a lot, and I thought, in fact, I got asked this question again recently and was like, would you do a podcast on this? And I said, well, it's not even worth a podcast, and that obviously is falsified because I'm doing a podcast on it. But the question that I get asked a lot, well, among many, is what would you say is the main difference between socialism and communism, or does that matter? And sometimes people add in also Marxism. What's the difference between socialism, communism, and Marxism? And does it matter? And the answer is surprisingly a little bit complicated, although we can say some stuff really simply right off out of the gate. So we'll start with a very simple thing, which is if we're looking at these as social and economic and maybe even political theories. So social, economic, political theories. Socialism means that the state owns the means of production. It also means that the state that owns the means of production is a socialist state that's going to engage in socialist activity, which is to say that it's going to do a redistribution of resources. The goal of a socialist economy or socialist socio-political circumstance is to redistribute access to the goods of society, those including kind of material goods, money, and so on, capital, whatever, but also the kind of cultural capital, social capital, so that everybody is made equal. We call that program equity. Socialism and equity are actually synonyms. This is what the Soviets called actual equality. And the idea is that there's going to be an economic basis for absolute equality from one individual to the next, and there's also going to be a socio-cultural basis for absolute equality from one individual to the next. And so that's sort of the kind of extreme take on what the socialist state exists to do. But the socialist state, in its most bare bones, anodyne definition, is simply a state that owns all of the means of production. And there are different types of these. Some of them will be Marxist in their orientation. Some of them will be Fabian in their orientation. The Fabian Socialist School, or English socialism as it's sometimes called, is another way of thinking about achieving a socialist program that actually leads to a communist program in the end without the violent revolution of Marx. So it's a little bit of a different school. There are various utopian socialist schools of thought and other ways of thinking about socialism that aren't necessarily Marxist. Marxism is one school of thought regarding socialism and, in fact, its relationship to communism. But here's where we can see the very simple difference. Socialism means that the state owns the means of production, and communism means that the people own the means of production. In other words, that the society is a giant commune, which is to say that the society operates like one giant family. Everything in the communist circumstance, and I didn't say state because communism doesn't actually believe in a state. Everything in the communist circumstance is in fact commonwealth, communally owned property. There is no private property whatsoever in a communist circumstance. And again, I didn't say state. I might slip up and say it at some point, but a communist state in its true form, you've probably heard the saying, real communism has never been tried. A truly communist state circumstance, I should say, is not a state. It rejects the concept of a state. The state will have, as Karl Marx put it, withered away of its own accord and would not exist. So now, rather than the state owning all of the property, maybe on behalf of the people, as it works out in practice for communist countries, it is the people who own everything in common, all by themselves, like a giant commune or family. And if you're thinking to yourself, that's probably not going to work for a couple of reasons, you're right. One of those reasons is, of course, that's not how human ownership between strangers works. We don't recognize that. We do recognize it in family because we have vested interests in promoting our own kin that do not extend to strangers, and particularly don't extend to free riders in our society. If you think that won't work because it's supposed to be at the end of the socialist program nightmare, which we haven't talked about yet, you're also correct, because the idea is that socialism is going to concentrate all of the power in the state under all of its ownership. So it will own and control all goods and resources in the society, including social capital. That's the socialist state. And somehow at the zenith of its power, according to Lenin and Stalin, it will relinquish itself. It will give away itself and wither away of its own accord. And thus you will have communal ownership that used to be guaranteed by the so-called socialist state, which Lenin incidentally called a semi-state, because it doesn't act in the same way that a normal state would, which is allegedly to preserve the class conflict of the existing society. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate this, because this is supposed to be the simple short answer part. So, short answer, socialism is that the state owns everything. Communism, everybody owns everything. That's all. So they are fundamentally actually different in that sense, except for that awful, sticky thing called in practice. In practice, they are not distinct, because in practice, there's no such thing as communism. Communism is an idea. In fact, communism is, it's like the heaven of the communist religion or the socialist project. Communism is actually envisioned as the kingdom of God that arrives when we've done socialism correctly enough and everybody believes it sufficiently. So what is Marxism? That's why did I make this weird segue? Because Marxism is the doctrine that explains this model of relationship between socialism and communism and lays out the communist theory. Marxism is a particular school of thought regarding socialism, communism, and in fact all of history and all of human activity, behavior, thought, and even philosophy, what it means to be human, what our role in life is, what a society should look like. So Marxism is a totalizing ideology of society that holds the belief that we are actually socialist animals who have forgotten that we're socialist because we became greedy through something like a religious fall of man, like the fall out of the Garden of Eden. We were communists in our little tribes, and we fell out of the garden of our little tribes by observing that we can own private property and use that to wield over other people. And we can alienate ourselves from one another and become individuals who own private property. So through the ownership of private property, which gets kind of maximized in a state of society called capitalism, later on down after feudalism and after slavery and after this kind of original primordial tribal communism, at that point, this capitalism, this private property ownership separates us one from another, but it can be overcome by realizing that that was all a fall. That was, and I mean that in the sense of like the Christian and Jewish fall of man, the sin of Adam and Eve eating the fruit. So, and then being ejected from the Garden of Eden. So in a sense, communism is like returning to Eden on our own terms. We get to go back. We get to live in this kind of perfect harmony by remembering who we really are. And who we really are, according to Karl Marx, is socialists. We are socialists who have been estranged from our true human nature by the result of the action of private property on our minds and our society, which causes us to see each other and ourselves as individuals who are separate from one another rather than one giant society. And for Karl Marx, socialism, therefore, is a state of awakening. It's a religious state. It is a state of having achieved a secret saving knowledge, in other words, a gnosis, that saves you from the imprisonment of life itself. Just being alive, living in society is imprisoning, but the saving grace, the saving secret knowledge about yourself is that you're a socialist and so is everybody else. You just have to remind everybody else. And that actually is how Marxism works as a religion, but Marxism's relationship between socialism and communism is what I already explained. Socialism is a stepping stone state. So the idea is that the trajectory of private property through history will culminate in a phase called capitalism, where people own their own stuff. It's not lords and ladies and the nobility and the royalty that own things and then we work as their serfs. No, everybody can own their own things. Everybody can use their own private property as they will. Everybody, in fact, can become their own master of their own property. and everybody has the fundamental right to exclude others from their private property. And then your capital actually represents your land holdings, the materials that you've accumulated, and also your capacity to do something with them. And so the idea is that the trajectory of private property, the idea of Marxism is that the trajectory of private property maximizes in capitalism, at which point, because in the end of capitalism, you end up with gigantic corporations that operate actually in a social means of production, according to Karl Marx. So you have bosses, you have a bureaucracy like human resources and so on. You have an entire social means of production, and that factory or that big corporation, think Apple or Nike or whatever, can do things that other smaller businesses could never have done. And what's going to happen, according to Karl Marx, is that there's going to be a literally violent and bloody revolution that seizes the means of production. It's going to take those big factories and concentrate them in the state, where the state is run by enlightened people who understand socialist theory, who understand Marxism itself. And they, by the very nature of the way that they organize the socialist takeover, will arrange society such that it resolves in communism. So socialism will be applied in greater and greater strength until everybody becomes so thoroughly socialist, so heavily brainwashed to believe that they are socialist and to live their lives as socialists, that the state force that's forcing them to do it against their own will is no longer necessary. And when that force of the state is no longer necessary, the state will dissolve itself, there will be no state, and we'll live in communism, which is exactly the same as socialism, except with no government making you do it. And so the relationship between socialism and communism and Marxism is that socialism is the necessary precondition to get to communism, because communism is socialism exactly, except that there's no state. So the idea is that all of private property ownership culminates in this kind of massive conglomerate called, or this massive multinational corporation state called, late capitalism or advanced capitalism. And that's a very social means of production. And rather than allowing a few private owners to own all of the big capitalist corporations, you're going to replace them with communal ownership, which is going to be codified in the state. And so capitalism will give way through bloody revolution to socialism, in which they seize the means of production. And then socialism is the way of living and organizing society and recognizing ourselves that lines up with the Marxist belief that we are intrinsically socialist, we're intrinsically all for one and one for all, like one giant happy commune. But we've forgotten that because of private property. So we have to have the private property forced out of our hands. And when we are sufficiently beaten into believing that this is who we really are, not one or two of us or 100 of us or 1,000 of us, but literally all of us who survive the process, when we reach that point, then allegedly we're going to live like one giant happy marriage of everybody to everybody, where everybody takes according to their need and gives according to their ability. And because everybody's perfectly brainwashed into believing that they are socialist in the sense that Karl Marx says is our true human nature, there will be no need for a state to force us to do it. And so that's the difference between socialism, state ownership of production, and communism, which is communal ownership of production, through the relationship of Marxism, which is this theory about how economics and social and political life can be transformed from one step to the next throughout history, that culminates in a revolution that sets up socialism, state ownership and control of everything, that eventually becomes communism, which works exactly the same way except without a government. And again, I go back to the point that I made earlier. If you think that sounds completely crackpot, you're right. If you think that sounds completely unrealistic, you are right. Like I said, there are other schools of thought The Fabian school of thought doesn't believe in violent revolution like the Marxists. It believes in basically all the same stuff, except its model is infiltration and gradual incremental change. So you get inside the institutions, you take them over one person at a time, and you just turn every corporation, every institution, every university, every nonprofit, every government cabinet, every parliament, every government overall into a Fabian socialist government system that owns and controls all the means of production until eventually that's no longer needed and you get communism. Again, Fabian socialism is also called English socialism, and its key difference from Marxism is that it rejects the idea of a bloody revolution to achieve socialism, preferring subterfuge and infiltration instead. There are other forms of socialism like fascist that are explicitly anti-Marxist and never attempt to end in communism. So socialism is somehow technically distinct from communism. The fascist model holds that the state and the corporations will fuse into a single entity. We might call that a public-private partnership today. But they are still going to continue to manage everything that way. There's no illusion that the state is someday going to dissolve itself and give way and liberate mankind from the oppression of either corporation or of state. The state and the corporation will become one oppressive body that's for everybody's common good, allegedly, and that's how fascism works. But that's a different model of socialism than the Marxist one that is a good example to show you that socialism and communism are not perfectly identical, but communism is a particular religious belief about the potentials of a full-blown socialist society and where it can go. So I hope that's clarifying. I know there's a lot there, but that I covered. It was not as simple as I thought it would be, but it's important to understand socialism, communism, Marxism, also Fabianism and fascism, and their relationships to one another. So I hope this is helpful.